My name's Sarah Wilson, and I'm a designer here at Google, and one of the creators of this series, Design Is. We started this series as a way to make space for the design community to talk about the intersection of design and technology, and really crafting a future we all want to be a part of. And so our topic tonight really sits squarely within our theme, Design is Equitable. I know when I started here at Google about 5 years ago, I was amazed and continue to be amazed at the number of people that use our products every day around the world and in all these different scenarios. So really excited to hear from our two speakers tonight. We've got Jen and Nithya. Jen leads the accessibility UX team at Google and works to make Google products universally accessible by developing standards and consulting with teams across the organization. Nithya is a researcher leading research on underrepresented communities within the next billion and artificial intelligence space. Her research has covered topics such as internet access, grid electrification, crisis response, civic engagement, and more in the emerging markets. So let's give it up for our speakers tonight.
Hi, I'm Nithya.
I'm Jen.
And we are here today to talk about our experiences building equitable products in accessibility, gender equity, and AI. And over the years, we've been building equitable technologies for underrepresented communities, and we'd like to share with you a practical framework for applying equitable design and research in product development. So even though 1 billion people in the world today have some form of a disability, according to the Business Disability Forum, 70% of UK-based websites do not pass basic accessibility standards. Consider a common mechanism that we encounter online to distinguish humans from robots. CAPTCHAs, these are Turing tests to make users identify obscure text. However, the task inherently excludes people with disabilities. A CAPTCHA can be difficult or even impossible for people with low vision, blindness, or dyslexia. ProPublica reported on how a predictive algorithm to identify recidivism was particularly likely to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate as white defendants. Brisha Borden and her friend Shade Jones were two teenage girls who committed a petty crime. Despite being their first time, they were classified as medium risk. And it is argued that knowing the risk, the judge raised the bond amount from $0 to $1,000. Women all over the world face online harassment, misogyny, and trolling in some form. Rana Ayub, a senior Indian journalist, discusses how she has been repeatedly attacked using online platforms through hate speech, Photoshop tweets, and deepfake porn videos made off her face. One of the ways in which women respond is by simply reducing their online participation. Only 8% of Wikipedia contributors are reported to be women because of anticipated harassment. Are technology designers intentionally discriminatory, racist, or misogynist? Why do these incidents occur? There could be a number of reasons, but you could argue that the people involved are ethical, and yet this seems to happen. Today, we can launch a new app that can be made instantly available all over the world. The scale of technology is unprecedented in human civilization. Therefore, when we miss an entire population or a context, it can lead to unintended consequences. At scale, this can be a really large problem, something we struggle to understand since both technology and society are complex systems. Technology is not a value-neutral medium. It has inherent properties which can include or exclude communities, depending on their social, cultural, or economic conditions. Unintentional exclusion has the same impact as intentional exclusion. It does not matter what the intentions are. It's the outcomes that matter. The good news, though, is that there is a shift in the technology industry and media in the zeitgeist of what our responsibilities are. Equity has become much more important than ever before. It's not a nice to have or an optional criterion anymore, it is mandatory. So our talk is about making equitable choices in design and research and product development. And we are here to share with you a framework that we have found effective in driving our own inclusion-based initiatives in gender equity and accessibility. You could be single-handedly making a change in a product feature, have an organizational mandate, or have a fully funded and dedicated initiative for equity. And our hope is that our talk provides best practices that could be useful for a variety of use cases.
Thanks. So we're going to talk about three main topics. We recognize that it's really hard sometimes to start these equity initiatives, especially in large organizations. So we aren't going to provide an explicit formula that you can follow to a T. Instead, it's a framework, as Nithya said, of insights that we've gained over our time. The framework is drawn from our work in gender equity online and accessibility.
For gender equity, we draw our insights from having conducted qualitative and quantitative research in 7 countries, from Brazil to Indonesia, and we spent the past 2 years working with various Google teams to make technologies more gender equitable, as well as sharing our work in policy, industry, and academic venues.
And from accessibility side, we're drawing from years of experience and really trying hard to develop a product design and development culture that really puts accessibility first. We're trying to focus on shifting that mindset, and we started with focusing on foundational research and understanding all of those unmet user needs that we hadn't discovered before. In addition to that, we were also looking at how are teams and organizations working? What are their processes? And where are there opportunities and gaps where we could actually bring accessibility in to make it a more holistic experience? Okay, so with that, let's start talking about how we can make a case for equity. For each of these parts in the framework, we're outlining some common challenges that we've seen. So for making a case, teams or organizations could be unclear on how this even fits with the business goals. It could be difficult to get this type of work prioritized with competing efforts. And finally, and something I think that is relatively unique to this topic, is some teams or individuals might feel a bit uncomfortable with the implications of even being asked to work on this. And we'll talk more about that in a sec. So let's start with how to demonstrate that this is good for the organization. It's really common to kind of start with the ethical case here. It's the right thing to do. And you can do this very effectively by going out and talking to users of these different diverse groups that maybe you hadn't talked to before. Understand, observe, what is their experience like using your product or service, whatever it is. Bring this back to the teams, and it's a really important critical step and can gain a lot of initial traction. And what we've seen, though, is that this gets you pretty far, but sometimes kind of peters out after people are like, okay, this is great and effective, but I don't really know what else to do with this. So this is where you can then move on to making a technical case. And based on those insights you've learned from maybe your research and the unmet needs you've identified, you can position these as challenges to teams of how can we solve these using newer technologies such as ML or AI. And really positioning it as a challenge that we need to get together and solve can be a really invigorating way to get more involvement. And then finally, it's extremely useful to really focus on the business case. Creating more inclusive products can actually grow and drive product growth because you're starting to now tap into those untapped markets that you hadn't been focusing on before. Additionally, you can actually position things and noting that focusing on more inclusive products, as well as having a more inclusive, an inclusive design process, can actually benefit you as an organization and differentiate your product and your organization from your competitors. Another tactic that can be really useful to make a strong case is to partner with teams that maybe have similar goals, such as privacy or internationalization or localization. The great thing here is that you can kind of package these efforts to leadership as these are additional things we need to think about when we're developing robust and holistic products. They can't be thought of separately. In addition to kind of pitching it that way, you can work with these types of teams and understand what are we, each of us, our individual teams, what are we asking of these product teams to do? What kind of information do we need from the product teams? What tasks are we asking them to do from maybe a localization perspective? And are there opportunities to kind of align and ask together and streamline the information you need from these product teams to make it just a more easier process for teams to adopt going forward? Another key thing is to ask if your product has considered all the stakeholders. This is just getting at asking a maybe obvious but important question. What if your product is negatively impacting 5% of a market that you hadn't really focused on before? Is that okay? Is that what you really intended? We really want to understand the experience, obviously, from different perspectives, and really, again, focus on shifting that mindset to be open to hearing about ways people are using our products that we maybe never thought about before, and thinking about how we can help those people. Framing is really important with this work, and sometimes personal ethics can deeply conflict here with professional ethics, such as thinking about animal rights versus testing that might be necessary in some fields. So therefore, it's really important to understand that teams might feel like maybe they're being personally attacked. Your ethics are being personally attacked. Or some teams or individuals might just not feel comfortable about talking about this topic overall in fear of offending others. So when you're having these initial discussions, it's important to have some ground rules of how to talk about this. Ensure that people that might be relatively quiet have a voice and can speak up. And another great thing is to establish some common vocabulary so people can talk about this topic comfortably and talk about it in the same manner. Okay, finally, for making your case, this is often unfamiliar territory for a lot of people. And in our experience, we've gotten received a lot of questions of, okay, I understand this concept, but what does it really mean to have an inclusive product or an ethical product? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And this is where you really need to hone in on providing concrete examples. There's a lot of great examples out there on the web from other companies and reports that you can take. In fact, on the screen up here, we have one example here. It's called the Shirley card. Has anybody heard of that? No hands. Okay, so this was from Kodak. Oh, one in the back. This is from Kodak back in the day, and they use this kind of as a template to understand skin tone. And as you can see by this picture, it's all based on white skin. And so the results of that is that people with darker skin tones, when photos were taken of them, it was very washed out and dark, which is not what they intended or wanted. Additionally, we just wanted to highlight that you can actually create your own examples here as well. And what we found useful is that if in talking about this topic, you can find people or teams that are particularly interested and engaged in this, and you can use and ask them to be your pilots and say, hey, it looks like you're working on this new feature. Can we test out this more inclusive product development process with your team? And through that, obviously, and hopefully you'll have an amazing case study at the end that you can then pitch and sell going forward. And even if it doesn't go great, it's an amazing learning opportunity to kind of work out the kinks as you continue.
How did we make the case for gender equity online, a fairly non-traditional topic for the technology industry? We started off by analyzing the access landscape, how many women are online in various countries around the world. We also built an ethical case around advancing human rights and creating an inclusive digital space as more women come online. And finally, we built a technical case around how our products can address computing challenges in privacy, safety, and machine learning. We also got initial support from a few products which demonstrated the potential impact that we could possibly have and built confidence.
For accessibility, As I mentioned before, a lot of our initial efforts focused on the story of doing the right thing. And again, similarly as I said before, it took us pretty far, but unfortunately, it didn't get us as far as we had liked. So it was really good for us to understand what was that untapped market potential. And there's actually great data out there already, and anyone can take this from online and use it. But just noting that there's $8 trillion of collectible disposable income with people with disabilities and their friends and families worldwide, or $21 billion of discretionary income of working age people with disabilities in the United States. This is really powerful and can help engage people, at least talking more about this and understanding that, oh, there is this pretty significant portion of users we're not talking about. So this is good. But believe it or not, sometimes even that doesn't help. And so this is because often teams might feel like, okay, that's great, but we still don't feel that of our total target user base, that people with disabilities is still a small percentage. And it's just not worth our time because it just takes too much time. This is a common story we get and push back sometimes. And so it's a great way to kind of reframe this is to help teams understand that actually disabilities kind of are on a spectrum. And yes, of course, there are people with permanent disabilities that might be more extreme, like users that are blind or people that are in wheelchairs permanently. But there's also this notion of people with temporary and situational disabilities. And this is where, like in these pictures shown up here, if you have a broken arm or an ear infection that's temporary and it prevents you from using your hands or hearing for a while, or on the situational side, it's just consider it a very temporary disability. Like in this image up here, if you're holding a bag of groceries or a child in one arm, obviously you don't have full mobility as you would with two free hands. So this is a great way to kind of, again, shift the way people think about this. Another way that we found is to kind of step away of thinking about this from a disability, but think about it from a usability perspective and say, okay, team XYZ, what's your hands-free story here, or eyes-free? And a lot of people can resonate with that because they're already thinking about it from like a driving directions perspective or thinking about how people use their phones on the go. Or what if it's a partially audible scenario where you're in a loud environment, but you have some sound or auditory information that's really important. So this is another really useful tactic that we found.
So once we've made the case, how can we create a knowledge foundation and principles to act upon? Some of the resistances that one might encounter in creating an equitable foundation are lack of clarity on what knowledge, tools, or resources would be valuable for teams, not knowing when to stop or when the foundation is ready to work off of. From the research side, when do we know that our insights are evergreen and long-lasting and broadly applicable to various product teams? And not having enough resources like people or money to build a foundation. Start by conducting foundational research on the problem space to get a baseline understanding of diverse people's practices and needs. There's no substitute for actually talking to the communities that you're designing for. Use this knowledge to build empathy for various teams, for example, by videos, reading transcripts, which will help you build a lasting foundation that is internalized by the various teams and that lasts beyond the presentation. However, we may not always have enough resources to carry out comprehensive research. A highly scalable and efficient technique is to partner with other organizations that have deep commitments and expertise in working with the communities, like NGOs, research institutions, and universities. Use what's already out there. Like Jen mentioned, there's a decent amount of equitable design work that's already online and secondary literature that you can reference. Another way to gather diverse viewpoints is simply to make your existing efforts more inclusive. For example, in research, can you start sampling for gender equity, start including people with disabilities or LGBTQ community members, so that existing processes are more diverse and the claims are more broadly valid? To create a design foundation, you could audit your products using existing checklists like the W3C guidelines or our emerging markets framework to assess the current state and evaluate problems. So in our gender equity online initiative, the challenge was that we were a small team, one researcher, one designer, one program manager. How could we build a lasting foundation of relevant insights for various products at Google, and that could be applied more broadly to various technologies? So firstly, we constructed a research approach in 7 countries to do comparative research across various contexts. And in order to understand the gender equity space, we used both qualitative and quantitative methods to understand the whys, whats, and the hows. We worked with several NGOs that work with communities like FGM survivors, abuse survivors, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, and technology communities like Google Research Scholars and Lean-In members. We also attended several community events like Pride Marches in our countries of research. Sensitivity is key to conducting equitable research because many of the communities are marginal. So we took 3 months to create an ethical research protocol, like conducting research in safe and neutral sites away from the home, same gender moderation, redaction of personally identifying information, and so on. In order to learn about women in various countries, we established university partnerships in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, and Mexico. That helped us scale our research, despite being a small team, learn from regional expertise, and establish academic ties. A year and a half of research led to a mountain of data and findings. So we structured this vast research into this one visual framework: access, content, privacy, and safety. And this has been referenced over and over again in various meetings, workshops, presentations, and has become sticky and memorable.
For accessibility, we learned pretty quickly that there's a relatively steep learning curve to understand truly how to design and develop fully accessible and good experiences. And personally, I'm still learning about this after being in it for about 5 years. Since our goal was to actually get other teams to do this work, we didn't want to be the central team. Like Nithya, we were a very small team. We knew that we had to scale our efforts. And so we knew that teams would benefit from this solid foundation of resources, tools, and insights. We also started focusing on foundational research. So you see a theme here. This is a great place to start. Go out and talk to your users. We did it of users of many different disabilities, doing many field studies for the most part, and really just trying to understand what is the day in the life, again, what are their unmet needs, their challenges, how they work around issues and problems. And from that foundational research, developing a number of different resources that teams could use. So some examples are videos. You have these day in the life videos. From there, we created personas that teams can use then and bring into design sprints or brainstorms. Accessibility design guidelines. This is an area where there are actually a lot of guidelines already out there on the web from agencies that focus on accessibility, and we just tailor those a bit to our material design guidelines. So this was a really useful effort, and again, it just gave teams something to start with. And then additionally, like I mentioned in the beginning of this, the other thing we were really cognizant of is we didn't want to just throw these resources out to teams and let them fend for themselves and understand how to use them. And additionally, we didn't want to just create yet another process that teams had to follow, because there's already enough things that people need to think about, right, when they're building products. So this is where we did take time to understand, okay, what is kind of the common product development process that most of the teams in the organization follow. And then again, identifying where can we integrate thinking about accessibility. So for example, for teams that had pretty well-established design reviews, we went and talked to them and said, hey, how about you think about accessibility at this point and actually have a checklist, or talk to the designers and ask, how have you been considering contrast or your keyboard navigation experience? Similarly, on the research side, anytime we understood that teams were going out and doing research, be it foundational or evaluative, are you including people with disabilities in there? That's a great opportunity to at least get those conversations started and those insights brought into the team. Okay, so question, has anybody been in a similar situation where maybe you're not focusing on equity, but you're kicking off a new effort project, you've done all this legwork, gotten some initial buy-in, and then things start to fizzle out? Anyone? No one? Oh, okay, a few raised hands. Right, and that's the last thing we would want to do here, right? We put a lot of hard work into building this foundation and getting this initial buy-in. So we want to ensure that we can drive sustainable impact. So here, some of the common challenges we found is that, probably pretty obvious, that efforts do lose momentum, right? There's a lot of personnel changes, new priorities come into play, and things get deprioritized. Another interesting thing we found in this space is that teams, even though with all these great resources and stuff and general buy-in, they still might not understand the real specifics of how to do this work. And then finally, teams might actually feel still a bit overwhelmed or even discouraged. And this can come from the feeling that it's just too big and broad. Like, I can't go out and talk to all of these users with disabilities and different genders and stuff like that. It's just too much. Or they might feel like we're never going to make everyone happy, so why do we even care? Unfortunately, we don't want that. So to address this, the first thing to do, and this might be pretty obvious, but it is important, and we found this to be crucial, is to establish top-level and formal goals with your executives or leadership. Along the way, while building the initial buy-in and establishing your foundation, you may have had a lot of maybe peers and teams get excited and involved, but you still really need that more formal buy-in from leadership that this is an agreed upon goal for the organization or team, whatever level you're thinking about. So whatever goal tracking system you have, if it's OKRs or anything else, it's really important to try to get that documented. Whatever the effort is or whatever your specific goal is around this effort of equity, getting those written down in order to hold teams accountable. Similarly, as with any project, it's really important to have clear success metrics. And I think especially in this area where sometimes the teams that are developing the products and designing them, they might not be the direct receivers and understand the impact that's actually being made by making these products more equitable. So you want to be sure to communicate the impact more frequently throughout the experience, and just demonstrating actually we are making an impact, and just keep those lines of communication open to continue to encourage and motivate the teams. Sometimes people ask, well, what kind of metrics are we talking about? Obviously, I think a lot of it just depends on your product, but the main thing to think about here is whatever the metric is that you have already established as a success metric, maybe it's adoption or conversion, just kind of think of that through the lens of these new diverse users or segments. So what is the adoption rate of this diverse group XYZ? Some other ways you can think about this are you receiving fewer complaints or more positive reviews from different user groups? Even accumulating positive or maybe negative press stories can be useful, just to continue and sharing that message of how the team is doing. This point here is about this notion that when you were building that foundation initially, through all of those amazing insights, you were developing maybe a number of different types of resources. Again, the personas, the design guidelines, et cetera. All of those things can be really useful. But at this point, you're interested in scale, right? You want the teams to start doing this work for you, essentially. And so you can't be there to handhold them and show them, oh, this is the exact resource you need and how to use it. So one of the things that we found useful is to kind of bring these things together and into a toolkit, playbook, whatever you want to call it, but bringing some sense and organization to all of these resources so that teams are clear on exactly how and when to use these different resources. The other thing that I wanted to highlight that we found effective is even with like the best designed or organized toolkit, teams still feel overwhelmed, right? There's a lot of great resources that often come out of this research. So just highlight one or two things that teams can start with. And just to get their feet wet and get involved in this type of work and this type of thinking can be really beneficial versus overwhelming them with a million choices. And then finally, to kind of bring all of this work home and really drive it home to teams, we found that workshops can be really effective. So you as kind of the expert in this area now can come to the workshops, and then obviously the team members that are the product experts can come to these workshops. And together you can kind of take a step back and say, what is the experience for product XYZ for these different user groups, and how can we make them more equitable? And actually brainstorm and work through those together. So obviously this is an amazing opportunity for training, and it's a really rich and robust way. And then as those team members go off to their teams or even their future teams, it kind of propagates this learning and this way of thinking, which can be really effective.
So Jen and I have diametrically opposite framing challenges with our research communities. Accessibility is something that many may not have closely encountered in their lives. Gender is something that is all too familiar and a subjective and a personal topic for most people. So we worked with various teams to conduct workshops and apply research insights into product features, design, or go-to-market plans. Teams usually bring metrics and product expertise to their table, like Jen mentioned, and we bring the gender expertise, and together we co-create solutions. Unlike traditional sprints where research is shared in lightning talks and then we move on to user journeys and defining the product, the research is the centerpiece of our workshops, and we divide the workshops into our 4 themes of access, content, privacy, and safety, and dive deep into these topics. We also had to help teams unlearn their assumptions around gender, especially from the vantage point of product team members in Silicon Valley. We also had a translation challenge with converting gender equity insights into tactical product features. So therefore, we use a variety of activities in our workshops to apply the insights into the product. First, we introduced teams to how to talk about gender, and we introduced the concept of post-colonial feminism, which provides a common vocabulary, even though individuals bring their own lenses. We use scenarios, for example, on device sharing to identify how the product should respond to various use cases. And to break up the monotony of a long workshop, we also use quizzes like through identifying whether the content is fake or not, which many women encounter, especially in health and money domains. Surprisingly, this is hard. And our approach has been to share our work widely, both inside of Google as well as outside into various communities. We presented at the United Nations, the World Bank, IO, CHI, SOUPS, and many internal fora at Google.
So to drive sustainable impact within accessibility, we basically followed all the things we just talked about earlier, such as providing a playbook, which has been really effective for us. In addition to that, though, we also wanted to find opportunities throughout the year within the organization to kind of reinvigorate teams and really highlight the work that's going on in accessibility. So there is an accessibility week. I think this happens in a number of companies across the world. And here's an opportunity for teams to showcase the great work they've been doing, do research events or workshops, and also highlight the unmet needs still that we haven't achieved, and give teams some encouragement of some new design challenges that are out there. And this doesn't have to be just one week, obviously, throughout the year. This can be ongoing, but events like this can be really critical in helping just resurface that, because there is sometimes that kind of lull where people get a bit complacent. And so it's a good reminder and refresher. And then finally, another thing that's been really effective in sustaining this, as I mentioned before, is we can't do this all ourselves, right? No matter how passionate we are, we just can't scale to do this, especially in large organizations. So establishing some sort of championship program or something in that nature can be really effective, where you can take those people maybe you originally start with that show just some general or genuine interest in this and give them more training, have more kind of explicit goals for them, such as, okay, you've been trained, now you can be the trainer, now go train your team, have some workshops with your team, see if you can influence processes within your team or organization, and really kind of continue that work forward. One thing I just wanted to highlight for this, for any program like this, and maybe some of you are already aware of it, but we found that to, again, keep that momentum going and keep people excited about this, you really do need to think about how to reward and recognize them as well. So that's really important to consider in these programs as well.
So to sum up, we discussed a framework on how to make design and research more equitable, starting with making the case through business, technical, and ethical cases, creating a knowledge foundation with diverse people and understanding their practices and needs, and achieving sustainable impact through clear goals, metrics, and workshops. There are plenty of resources that are available online. Some of the canonical resources for accessibility are on material design. For gender equity, look up design.google/NBU and on Google Scholar. We want to end the talk by saying that it's inherently challenging to do equitable design, and we acknowledge that. This is an open-ended space. There are no clear formulae or templates that you can simply apply. And while we have shared some of our experiences here, you may have to modify or improvise for your conditions. And there are many ways to achieve and define equity. It's a pluralistic enterprise, especially when there are multiple members that are involved in a project. If there's one thing you can take away from this talk, ask the tough questions. Because if you don't, who else will? Thank you. Write to us about your experiences with equitable design and research. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Nithya and Jen. That was awesome. We're going to open up to the room for questions. Myself and Nicole have mics, so raise your hands.
I think there's one in the back.
Hey, thanks. So at the outset, I heard the examples given of the problem of ML data sets being heterogeneous or misrepresentative or poorly representative of a larger community, and the other example of AAA compliance. I'm less clear, aside from the big data set, research base example, how other communities might be affected by this kind of design. Can you provide some problems that you see in design, some examples, some don'ts, basically, to help kind of make this problem more concrete?
So more examples of how inequitable design can impact different types of users besides people with disabilities, or?
Yeah, I think AAA is kind of a base standard we understand, but
Yeah.
I'm not clear maybe on some of the cases of gender or of LGBTQ communities, aside from the case where they might be misrepresented or not represented in an ML data set. Like what can we do, or what's the problem that we might run into if we're not taking this into account?
Yeah, I think our framework is a good starting point here. So let me start with the ML example. When women are, so in 2/3 of the countries worldwide, there are more male users than female users. And when that happens, there are the data sets of women, the training data around women is just much smaller than the male majority data. And so the content that is presented to users tends to be more skewed towards majority user groups. But in addition to that, there are also considerations around simply starting with access. How can women get to the internet online? There are many assumptions that we make around if there is a network, then there is connectivity, then there is a user. But that's simply not true. There are many inherent socioeconomic constraints that prevent women from going online, like they simply have limited time because of housework or childcare responsibilities. There's limited physical mobility, which prevents them from going to, say, Wi-Fi hotspots. And that simply affects the uptake of technologies. Say with privacy, a common phenomenon that we've documented is around device sharing and how women are often in positions because of social expectations to share their devices. And that's something that we don't consider with one user, one account, one device paradigms. And it can go wrong when experiences are designed for one user and are used by multiple people, and accidentally incriminates content that someone else has browsed. Take safety. There are pressing concerns that women face with abuse that they face online and the consequences that can happen as a result, like stalking and impersonation. And so as technology becomes inevitably provides more connected opportunities through network capabilities and ability to communicate with other users of the product, we have to think about what are the implications when strangers can contact anyone online and what data can be taken from them and copied or abused or circulated virally online. So I hope that gives you some sense of how things can go wrong with technology.
Hi, I'm curious as to, has this guide been applied to an actual Google product or feature, and what was some of the a feedback or whatever more I guess specific results that you saw as to how the guide was actually able to improve accessibility or make the overall product I guess more equitable.
Go ahead if you want to talk about this part.
Yeah, we're working with a number of product teams. They're all in progress initiatives right now.
Yeah, on the accessibility side, we have through WCAG and stuff a number of standards that we work with teams on. One of the key things that we're working towards is moving away from the conversation from just compliance and actually thinking about what is the actual user experience. So a lot of our work is actually taking teams and running through their user journeys with people with disabilities to really get that true sense of what's the actual user experience and then building off of that.
Hi, loved your talk. How would you define success for this equitable design initiative this upcoming year?
So, so for accessibility, obviously a lot of our work, I would say just in general, right, for measuring the success of products, we're always looking at things like user satisfaction, and just the overall usability of our products. And that goes without saying that we're looking at that from the same perspective of people with accessibility needs. That's one of the things that we're really trying hard, again, is one of the key themes, I think, for all of this work is that we want to, again, a lot of mind shifting here, but we want to shift that mindset of thinking of this is like this extra other work. We want this really to be integrated into the way we just approach design in general. So as far as metrics go and stuff like that, we're using the same metrics. It's just now we're trying to look at them from these different perspectives to see are these experiences similar or evaluated as good or as bad.
Yeah, adding to Jen, on the gender side, there are a few simple metrics that you can use, and really it's not only limited to gender. You can apply this to any demographic. Understanding what's the market indicator for that particular demographic, as in, say, you're building a mobile money application, how many women have bank accounts? That's sort of the baseline. And then understanding from your product, how many women have accounts, what percentage of them are engaged, and so on, so that you can look at the delta between the possibility and where you are right now, and that helps teams understand where they need to go and where they are today.
Anyone else? I have one more question too. You talked about the sort of the three reasons why it's the right thing to do, that technical reasoning and the business case. Which ones have you found most actually effective, or does it kind of depend on the audience that you're that you're sort of trying to persuade in getting to buy in on doing this extra work, or not extra work, the work?
I personally have seen that you need all three. Again, it's not that it always falls sequentially in the way I kind of describe it through, but it often does, because I think it is easy. I mean, it takes work, but it is easier to just kind of show the experience and get that initial empathy buy-in. But again, when it comes down to, I agree with this. Of course, I don't want to, exclude people intentionally. There's still time and effort that needs to be put into that. So you need to make that business case as well of like why this is important.
Related to that point, I'm struggling with the idea of making a business case, sort of before we have the impact measured, right? So like, this is the potential business case, and it might be slim on an aggregate level, especially if, at Google, for example, where there are billions of users across the world. And so when we're making like really specific tactical trade-offs on the day-to-day, I'm curious if you've had conversations that are able to bring those things to light in a very tangible way, where you can say, okay, this is the thing that we're actually trading off here.
Yeah, I think this is where the idea of kind of creating your own case studies and doing pilots with certain teams to really prove out that the focusing on a more inclusive design product development process can pay off. Those initial numbers, of potential income and stuff is a way to kind of get that conversation started. And yeah, I agree, it's potential, right? So, but what I've seen in my experience is you do have to kind of prove it out a little bit, and that's why one strategy is to kind of see if there's an opportunity. And I will say one thing about all this work is I've learned to be so scrappy and opportunistic, and just like identifying if there are teams working on something and just kind of latching onto that and saying like, hey, can we test this out with you to prove out that case? I don't know if you had different experiences.
Yeah, not everyone has the luxury of 1 billion users, and if there's only 100 users, let's say, and it's a startup that's just starting out. To Jen's point, showing a qualitative improvement in how the experience can be improved for specific communities could be useful. I think it's also worth thinking about positioning within the larger industry in terms of how being seen as equitable today is actually a differentiator and can help recruit better technical talent onto the organization, and can improve the brand value as well.
Well, thank you for this awesome talk. I really appreciate it. That concludes our Design is Talk for the evening. Come hang out with us next month when we have another talk. We'll be sending out details shortly. But thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks to Nithya and Jen.
Thank you.